All right, so Imperialism, Part 1, Introduction. All right, in the chapter, you'll learn about the spread of European imperialism in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. And what you have here in this picture is this is England, and they're showing them kind of like an octopus reaching out for all the different places like Egypt, Asia, and really kind of throughout the world. You'll also learn uh, how through imperialism, European ideas and practices had far reaching impact on the rest of the world. So, all the ideas that were spread from Europe to the rest of the world and how it changed it. So, essential questions. The first one you'll have to answer after the questions, your online questions. So, what were the causes of the new imperialism? Second one, how did imperialism have different characteristics in different places? And the third one was the overall impact of imperialism good or bad? So, European imperialism. Imperialism refers to the political economic control of one area or country by another. So, England owning India at one time, that's imperialism. So in ancient times, countries like Persia, Rome, they built huge empires. They conquered their neighbors. We had already studied that type of imperialism. In the 15th century, European nations developed the first overseas empires in the Americas. In the 19th century, the European great powers suddenly acquired vast colonial empires in Africa, Asia, and throughout the Pacific. European countries had invested great efforts building colonial empires in the Americas from the 16th to the 18th century. The independence of the United States and Latin America had therefore uh, represented a huge setback to the European imperialists. So they had spent all this money on building up these different colonies, and then those two places broke away. So European rulers questioned the value of the colonies, and if they would suddenly declare independence just when they became valuable to England or Spain and their mother country. Even so, imperialism never totally died out. Even in the early 19th century, it continued in India, South Africa, East Indies, and several other places. So here's all the different times you had independence in Latin America. They're all kind of around the same time, the 1820s. So these were the areas that broke away. These are kind of the areas that, those places lost a lot of raw materials and money. And then imperialism, the fine art of conquering the world. So the British Raj, or the reign in India. So during the 18th century, the British defeated the French and many local rulers to extend their control throughout the Indian subcontinent. So the British rule brought a lot of changes in India. Some were good and some were extremely bad. So some of the older customs, like the suicide of widows when their husbands died, was stamped out. So they did not allow the widow to commit suicide, which has kind of been the custom, not for everyone in India, but in some places. So the first railway in India was built in 1853. That's a big deal because a lot of people still travel the railroads in India. Muslim and Hindus live peacefully together, really kind of for the first time, and after the British leave, they have a civil war. European missionaries spread Christianity into India. British schools and colleges opened. English became the official language of the government, and that kind of helped India later on because a lot of people from India are hired because they know English. And despite the benefits brought by the British, of course, many Indians were still upset by this challenge to their traditional ways. So they, of course, wanted to get rid of the British. They wanted to have their own country. So the Sepoy Mutiny is one of the first outbreaks of Indian independence. So the British were able to control India because Indians were divided amongst themselves. You had Muslims and you had Hindus, you had Sikhs, so you had a lot of different groups that the British used to fight against each other, and that way it was easier to control small groups. So the British, of course, had better weapons, and what they used was actually Indian soldiers, and they would train them, and these guys were called sepoys. So in 1857, a large number of sepoys rebelled, and the rebellion quickly spread, but the British crushed the revolt using other loyal Indian soldiers. So after the mutiny, the British government took over formal control of India. So complete control. Formal control means you control all parts. So there's really no uh, independent groups in India or anything like that. And they abolished the company that was running India, which was called the East India Company. So India became an official British possession, which meant that Queen Victoria of England now became the Empress of India, and this is Queen Victoria right over here on the left. So the impact of British rule during the 2 decades of British rule, many aspects of the Indian life changed. In the government, the British provided a single system of law and government, unifying all of India. India had kind of been separated, all these different groups that had different interests. They provided jobs, they increased educational opportunities, and they introduced English as a unifying language. In economics, the British built roads, bridges, railroads, and set up telegraph wires. However, India's cottage industry, which is products that are made at home, were hurt by the competition of British manufactured goods. If you remember what we've been talking about in the Industrial Revolution, the British pretty much made clothes for the world. So when they brought in their cheap clothes that were manufactured, it wiped out really the main industry in India, which was cotton and making clothes. And in health, the British built hospitals, they introduced new medicines, and provided famine relief. Whenever you do that, the population increases. So if you come in with new medicines into a poor area, people live longer, have more kids, and then you have a huge population increase. So at the same time that the healthcare improvements led to a population explosion, without an increase in economic opportunities. So you have a bunch of people that are being born, and but you don't have any new jobs. So social Indians were looked down on by the British, and their culture was treated as inferior to European culture. Indian workers provided the British with inexpensive labor, and they just treated them like they treated the British in the Industrial Revolution. So they had long working hours, often under terrible conditions. And it got so bad that they actually had a famine in India because people couldn't support themselves and people couldn't grow food anymore because they were pushed out by the British companies. And this is when you have the Janwala Bagh massacre. And what happens is hundreds of Indians peacefully marching were surrounded and fired upon by a British general. And this is probably one of the saddest days in modern Indian history. And this is just one of the many examples of where the British government was ruthless and brutal on the Indian populace. So, and this was kind of the turning point after this, is really when Gandhi took off and kind of Indian independence was seen as something that needed to be done because of the brutal treatment of the Indian population. And this is really what happened. So you had your raw materials, which was really cotton, was sent to Britain. So it's taken out of India, sent to Britain to the factories. The factories turn it into cheap clothes, and then they come back and they sell that to India, forcing the Indians to buy the English goods. So other British colonies other than India, Britain also had several other colonies outside of India. It took the Cape Colony, which is in South Africa. It took that from Holland, and it took a lot of the islands in the West Indies. They also continued to control Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore. So everything in the red is controlled by Britain at this time. Other European colonies, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, France regained some of its colonies in the West Indies, as well as some of the trading posts in West Africa and in India. So in the blue areas here. Originally, again, they had owned Louisiana, but they sold that to the Americans. In the 1830s, France acquired Algeria here in North Africa, and the French also intervened in Indochina, which becomes Vietnam in the 1860s. Meanwhile, the Dutch continued to rule over the Dutch East Indies. Spain also had a few remaining colonial possessions. They owned the Philippines, which is out here. Uh, they also owned Cuba, and then they owned Puerto Rico. So Spain still they had lost a lot of their power, but they still owned some parts of the world.